November 28, 1943, Tehran, Iran. The city was restless. The war had reached even here, thousands of miles from the front lines, in whispers, shortages, and foreign uniforms. British soldiers patrolled certain quarters, Soviet agents watched others, and Americans, newly arrived in their jeeps and khaki uniforms, stuck out like tourists in a bazaar. Tehran was a city of layers, ancient stone walls and mud brick houses, oil fumes mixing with the scent of spice and dust. But beneath its surface, it had become a nest of espionage. Every hotel had bugs in the walls. Every market had eyes. Every rumor traveled twice before breakfast. And in the very heart of it all stood the Soviet embassy, a fortress of steel gates and guarded courtyards. Behind its walls, in a room whose windows were sealed against eavesdroppers, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and history. A long mahogany table was covered in maps: Europe, the Mediterranean, the Eastern Front, and the coastlines of France. Small flags, pins, and pencils lay scattered across them like pieces on a chessboard. At that table sat three men who would decide the fate of the modern world. Joseph Stalin, Premier of the Soviet Union, compact, heavy-shouldered, his eyes dark and unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. A pipe hung from his lips, its smoke curling upward in lazy coils. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, broad, rumpled, restless, a cigar burning down between two fingers. He fidgeted with papers, trying not to show how much he disliked being in Stalin's embassy. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States, pale, composed, seated in his wheelchair at the center of the table, his calm masking exhaustion. His health was failing, but his will remained unbroken. The air vibrated with tension. This was the first time all three of them, the so-called Big Three, had ever met in person. And yet the atmosphere was not one of celebration or camaraderie. It was something closer to a trial. The question that would not die. For 2 years, Stalin had asked the same question. When will Britain and America open a second front in France? Not in North Africa, not in Italy, not in the Balkans. In France, where it would matter. The Soviet Union had been fighting Germany alone since June 22, 1941, when Hitler had unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. 4 million men had crossed into Soviet territory, sweeping forward like an iron tide. Entire cities had been surrounded, armies annihilated, millions dead. Now, more than 2 years later, the Red Army had fought the Germans to a standstill. They had clawed back from the gates of Moscow, bled the enemy dry at Stalingrad, broken them at Kursk, the largest tank battle the world had ever seen. But the price had been unimaginable. Every meter of reclaimed ground was watered with Soviet blood. And through all of it, Stalin had waited, watching his Western allies fight a very different kind of war. Churchill leaned forward now, his hand resting on the map of Italy. His tone was practiced, polished, the voice that had inspired his island to defy Hitler in its darkest hour. "Mr. Stalin," he began, "surely you cannot deny that our campaign in the Mediterranean has drawn away German divisions from your front. Sicily, Salerno, we have achieved a series of decisive operations. The Italian surrender," he paused, searching for effect, "represents not merely a tactical success, but the crumbling of Axis Europe from the south." He wanted Stalin to see logic, to see Britain's empire as a strategic chessboard. But Stalin saw only delay. The Soviet leader said nothing. He tapped the ash from his pipe into a small dish, his expression unreadable. Then, in Russian, quietly, "When are you going to invade France?" The words were flat, not shouted, not dramatic, just final. Vladimir Pavlov, his interpreter, translated them into English, his voice trembling slightly. The silence afterward was thick enough to feel. It wasn't the first time Churchill had been asked that question, and not the first time he'd had no good answer. Ever since 1941, he had promised Stalin that Britain would open a second front soon. First 1942, then 1943, each time postponed. In 1942, he had flown to Moscow to explain why. He had tried to soften the news that instead of invading France, the Allies would strike French North Africa, Operation Torch. Stalin had listened in silence then too, his face turning to stone. When Churchill finished, the Soviet leader had asked only one question. How will fighting in Africa force Germany to pull divisions from the Eastern Front? Churchill had no satisfying answer. Now, in 1943, sitting across from Stalin again, he could feel that same cold stare drilling through him. While Churchill spoke of the Mediterranean, Stalin's mind returned to arithmetic, to numbers. 3 weeks earlier, Soviet troops had liberated Kiev. The city was in ruins, its streets blackened, its population shattered. For every German soldier killed, 5 Soviets had fallen. At Stalingrad, the Red Army had lost more men in 6 months than Britain and America combined had lost in the entire war. At Kursk, hundreds of thousands more. To the west, such numbers were incomprehensible. To Stalin, they were the measure of seriousness. While Churchill boasted of Italian advances, Stalin thought of the endless trains carrying wounded men from the front, the rows of empty villages, the orphans, the silence where entire towns used to be. Finally, Roosevelt cleared his throat. His voice, though weakened by illness, carried an authority that drew attention. "Let's talk about Operation Overlord," he said. The words shifted the air in the room. Churchill's smile tightened. He preferred his Mediterranean strategy, Europe's soft underbelly, he liked to call it, but Roosevelt had already made up his mind. Overlord would be the real thing, the cross-channel invasion, the second front Stalin had demanded for 2 years. Stalin looked up, his dark eyes glinting in the light. For the first time that day, he spoke without translation, in slow, deliberate English. "Good. Let us speak about that." The meeting would last for hours, stretching into the gray Tehran evening. Outside the embassy walls, the city buzzed with spies and soldiers. Inside, 3 men began the argument that would decide not just how the war would be won, but who would control the world after it ended. Part 2. The Ghosts of 1941, Summer 1941. Before Tehran, before the promises and maps and conferences, there was only shock, the shock of invasion. At dawn on June 22nd, the German guns opened fire along a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Artillery thundered, the sky turned gray with smoke, and without a declaration of war, 4 million men crossed into Soviet territory. To the west, it was just another headline. To Stalin, it was a nightmare made real. For months, British intelligence had warned Moscow, Hitler is preparing to strike. Churchill himself had sent word. Intercepted signals, troop movements, trains loaded with fuel and ammunition near the frontier. Stalin had dismissed them all. "It is a British trick," he said, "to drag us into their war." He believed Hitler wouldn't dare attack while still fighting Britain. He believed in the paper he had signed, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that fragile agreement of neutrality. He was wrong. In the first week, the Red Army lost over 2,000 aircraft, most destroyed before they could even leave the ground. Entire divisions vanished in forests and wheat fields. German tanks raced eastward, moving faster than the Soviet generals could draw lines on a map. By July, Minsk had fallen. By August, Smolensk, refugees clogged every road, families fleeing with carts, goats, whatever they could carry. Stalin retreated into silence. For days he vanished from public view. No radio address, no orders, nothing. In the Kremlin, his aides whispered that he had suffered a breakdown. Some even feared he might take his own life. But on July 3rd, he returned. His voice crackled over the radio, hoarse, low, unlike the iron rhetoric of old. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "our motherland is in mortal danger." It was the first time he had ever called the Soviet people brothers and sisters, and in that single phrase, he bound the nation to a fight to the death. The siege and the snow. That winter, Leningrad was surrounded. For 872 days, its people starved behind frozen defenses. Dogs, wallpaper paste, even sawdust bread, anything that could sustain life. 1 million civilians would die before the siege lifted. Further south, the German spearheads reached the outskirts of Moscow. From the Kremlin roof, Stalin could see the glow of burning villages. Snow began to fall. The first ally the Soviets ever had. At last, the German advance stalled. Siberian divisions, hardened by the cold, counterattacked. For the first time, Hitler's armies retreated. The world gasped. The Germans can bleed. But Stalin remembered the cost. Entire armies lost, factories burned, cities turned to ash. And still no second front in the West. The letter to Roosevelt. In early 1942, Stalin wrote to President Roosevelt. His message was brutally clear. Without a second front, the Soviet Union will be defeated. He wanted an invasion of France that year, anything to force Hitler to divide his forces. But America was still unprepared, Britain still reeling from years of bombing. Instead came promises, always promises. By spring, the Wehrmacht was advancing again, this time toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the Volga River. At Stalingrad, they met resistance unlike anything the modern world had seen. Stalingrad, the furnace. The city that bore Stalin's name became a furnace. House by house, floor by floor, men fought with bayonets, knives, shovels. German officers called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. Every day, Soviet troops crossed the Volga under artillery fire, bringing ammunition one crate at a time. Every night they dragged the wounded back across the ice. By February 1943, the German 6th Army, 330,000 men, was surrounded. On February 2nd, the survivors surrendered. It was victory, but a hollow one. The Red Army had lost more soldiers in that single battle than Britain and America together had lost since 1939. And still, Stalin waited for the West to join him. The growing fury. He watched the Allied campaigns in North Africa with bitter amusement. Churchill's sideshows, he called them. Sicily, Tunisia, Italy. To him, they were distractions, not salvation. When the British and Americans congratulated themselves for capturing Rome, Stalin's forces were burying 1 million dead at Kursk. By the time the Tehran Conference was announced, Stalin no longer trusted words. He wanted dates. He wanted blood shared. He wanted proof that his allies were fighting the same war he was. And so, in the late autumn of 1943, as the snows began again on the Russian steppes, he boarded a train south through the Caucasus, bound for Tehran, to meet Roosevelt and Churchill face to face. Behind his calm expression lay every memory of those 2 years, the warnings ignored, the cities lost, the 1,000,000 graves. He would listen politely, he would smoke his pipe, and when the time came, he would ask once more the question that had haunted every dawn since 1941. When will you open the second front? Part 3, Operation Overlord, November 28, 1943, Tehran, Iran. The conference room was still thick with cigarette smoke. A heavy winter sun filtered through the blinds, casting long lines across maps and papers. Stalin sat motionless, his hands clasped around the stem of his pipe, the glowing ember pulsing in rhythm with his thoughts. Churchill tapped his fingers on the table. Roosevelt sat quietly, eyes fixed on the Soviet leader, knowing he carried the weight of 2 years of betrayal and suspicion. The question lingered in the air. When will the Second Front open? Churchill's Mediterranean strategy. Churchill leaned forward, his broad shoulders hunched, as if bearing the weight of the British Empire itself. "Mr. Stalin," he began, voice careful, practiced, "our operations in Italy and the Mediterranean, Sicily, Salerno, have forced Hitler to divert divisions from your front. Surely this counts as pressure." He waved a hand toward the maps, toward the dotted lines tracing advances up the Italian peninsula. Stalin did not blink. He drew on his pipe, letting the silence stretch until Churchill's words felt like a polite insult. "When will you invade France?" Stalin asked in Russian, his interpreter translating with deliberate precision. It was a question, but also a demand. Churchill began again, speaking of the Channel, the need for landing craft, weather, the difficulty of coordinating the Allies, the same arguments he had given in Moscow, the same arguments Stalin had already heard and dismissed. In his mind, Stalin counted the costs. Kiev, liberated 3 weeks prior, yet thousands of Soviet soldiers lay in frozen fields. Stalingrad, 1 million casualties to encircle a single German army. Kursk, hundreds of thousands more, yet no second front. Italy was a sideshow. Every mountain and river delayed progress, tying down small German forces while the main Wehrmacht remained focused on the Eastern Front. If the Allies did not open the Second Front soon, the Red Army alone would bear the entire weight of Europe's liberation. Roosevelt leaned forward, his voice carrying authority and clarity. "We are committed to Overlord," he said. "The cross-channel invasion will happen in May 1944. The words were precise, concrete, a rarity in Stalin's experience of Western promises. No vague "soon," no conditional planning. Stalin's eyes narrowed. Then he turned to Churchill. "Do you believe in Overlord?" Churchill hesitated, ever the tactician, still harboring doubts about a direct assault on France. But Roosevelt's determination had shifted the balance. "Yes," Churchill said at last, his voice measured. "We are committed to Overlord." Stalin's next question cut to the heart of commitment. "Who will command Overlord?" The room went quiet. This was more than protocol. It was proof of seriousness. If the Allies had not chosen a commander for their most important operation, how seriously could they be taken? Roosevelt's advisors whispered names. General George Marshall, seasoned and strategic but needed in Washington. General Dwight Eisenhower, proven in North Africa and Italy. Roosevelt had not yet made a final decision. Stalin's expression remained unchanged, but his dark eyes told the room he understood the implications. No commander meant no real plan. "Overlord must have a commander," he said flatly. "Until it has a commander, it is just a name on paper." Churchill's Mediterranean arguments faltered. Stalin circled back repeatedly to Normandy, questioning every detail. "Number of divisions?" 40, Roosevelt replied. "Air superiority, overwhelming. Naval and landing craft, being produced at full capacity. Training underway across southern England. And most importantly, Stalin demanded assurance. This time, it will actually happen." Southern France. Stalin's strategic logic. Stalin insisted on a second invasion in southern France to split German forces and prevent them from concentrating on Normandy. Churchill protested. His focus remained on Italy and the Balkans. "Rome is not worth delaying Overlord by even 1 day, Stalin declared through his interpreter. Roosevelt agreed. The Americans would back Stalin's plan. Churchill found himself outvoted. British preference for peripheral operations could not outweigh combined Soviet-American strategy. Stalin pressed further. He wanted a specific date, not merely May 1944. Churchill cited tides, moon phases, and weather windows. Stalin was unmoved. "Give me a date, not a month, a date," he said. Roosevelt conferred with his staff. a compromise. The first week of May, with the exact day determined by conditions, and no postponement beyond that week except in case of impossible weather. It was specific enough for Stalin to trust, flexible enough to be militarily sound. If Overlord is postponed again, he warned, Soviet trust will be permanently damaged. Dinner and diplomacy. That evening, after the formal session, the three leaders moved to dinner. Churchill toasted alliances. Roosevelt raised a quiet glass to strategy. Stalin's toast was revealing. To American production, his interpreter translated. Without it, this war would be lost. He did not toast Britain. He did not toast Italy. The distinction was deliberate. Material support was genuine. Strategic delay was not. The Red Army speaks later in a smaller gathering. Stalin spoke freely. The Red Army knows how to attack. We do not wait for perfect conditions. We attack when attacking is necessary. The message was clear. While the Western Allies had waited for perfection, Soviet soldiers had died. Roosevelt reassured him Overlord would happen. May 1944 was real. Commitment was backed by American industry, strategy, and determination. Stalin was satisfied. Not trusting, but satisfied. He had extracted a date, a commander, assurance that the Second Front would finally open. The Tehran Conference would conclude on December 1st, 1943. Stalin returned to Moscow. Roosevelt and Churchill returned to their capitals. The commitments made in that smoke-filled room would shape the final 18 months of the war. Eisenhower would be appointed supreme commander. Landing craft would roll off American docks. Divisions would assemble. Training exercises would intensify. By early June 1944, the Second Front, the one Stalin had demanded for 3 years, would finally exist. The stage was set. Hitler's Germany would face enemies on 2 fronts, and Stalin would watch, waiting for the proof that words had become reality.